They warned he'd die helping the lion. He ignored it, and the unthinkable happened. They told him to step back. They told him he was being reckless. They told him a lion in pain doesn't think, it only reacts. Michael heard all of it and still knelt in the dust, wire cutters in his shaking hands. A breath away from the animal everyone else feared, Tao's paw was tangled in a snarl of barbed wire at the edge of the sanctuary fence. Blood darkened the golden fur of his leg. Each time he tugged, the barbs bit deeper. The air smelled like iron and dry grass. Michael kept his voice low, the kind of tone you use with a terrified horse or a wounded dog. "Easy, big guy. I'm here." He didn't know if the lion understood the words, but tone can carry meaning the way water carries light. Behind him, the world pulsed with panic. Tom, the director, barked orders. A pair of rangers argued about angles and line of sight. Somewhere to the left, Lisa, the head vet, kept saying 5 minutes, just 5 minutes, until the tranquilizer would be ready. 5 minutes, Michael thought, can be the difference between a wound and a death spiral. Heat shimmered off the sand. Sweat slid into his eyes. His hands were steady anyway. He snipped one wire, then another. The metallic clicks rang too loud in the tense air. Tao's breathing thundered in Michael's chest. A low growl rolled out of the lion. Not a threat so much as a warning. "I feel everything you do." Michael murmured back. He didn't look away. That was important. Predators understand steadiness. They also understand fear, and fear was the one thing Michael refused to offer. People always assume courage is the absence of fear. Michael knew better. He'd learned that in Detroit alleys and desert training grounds, and in the quiet nights of the preserve when something wild screams from the dark. Courage is choosing your next good act and doing it anyway. The preserve had become the first place where that choice didn't eat him alive. The animals gave him a kind of truth other places didn't. Tao most of all that he'd watched the lion's long climb back from a private cage to morning strength, from dull eyes to a roar that rattled tin roofs at dawn. You don't forget a creature that refuses to stay broken. Maybe that was why Michael couldn't stand still today. Maybe that was why the rules felt too far away from the living, bleeding present. Another snip. The wire recoiled and bit his forearm. A thin line of blood snaked toward his wrist. Someone cursed. Someone else shouted, "Foster, back away." That's an order. He didn't move. The lion's eyes were amber glass, bright with pain and something he couldn't name. Not reason, exactly. Not gratitude. Attention, Michael slid the cutters under the tightest wrap. The barb had pierced the pad clean through. He would need to free it without tearing more flesh. Almost there, he whispered, more to keep his own focus than to soothe the lion. Tao flinched and the wire chattered. Michael froze, breathing with him until the tremor passed. "Good. Stay with me." From the edge of the crowd came the fast, nervous click of a camera. Sarah, the visiting photographer, was working like a metronome. Tom hated it, but Michael was oddly relieved. If he got this wrong, at least the story wouldn't be told as rumor. 2 minutes, Michael. Lisa called, softer now. "We're close." He could hear the hurry in her stillness. He could hear his own pulse in his ears point one more cut. The last coil loosened, then fell. The paw was nearly free, except for the deepest barb, buried in the pad like a cruel stitch. Michael lifted the cutters away and reached for the wire with his fingers. Tao leaned forward. The world snapped tight. Rifles lifted. A safety clicked. Tom's voice tore the air. "Do not move." Michael did the only thing that felt true. He went very still, eyes on the lion, breath shallow, and said, in a voice steady enough to surprise himself, "Don't shoot." Tao's head lowered until Michael felt the heat of his breath on his cheek. The lion's whiskers trembled. For one suspended heartbeat, no one knew what would happen next. For a breathless moment, the world hung between silence and chaos. Tao's face was inches from Michael's, the weight of his amber gaze pressing harder than any gun barrel. The lion's mane brushed his shoulder as the animal shifted forward, and the rangers behind him braced for blood. But the blow never came. Instead, Tao exhaled in a low rumble that vibrated through Michael's bones, then pulled back just enough to test his freed paw. The wire was still lodged in the pad, but he no longer fought the fence. He simply stood there, towering over the man who had broken every rule to help him. Gasps rippled through the onlookers, voices rising, rifles still aimed. Michael didn't dare look away. He could see the exhaustion in Tao's trembling muscles, the thin film of dust clinging to his muzzle, the restless twitch of his tail. The lion's chest heaved with every breath, each one a reminder of how close he was to the edge. Stress, blood loss, and the searing sun could tip him into collapse at any moment. Michael's instincts told him the tranquilizer team might be too late if they waited longer. But those same instincts warned him that another sudden move could shatter whatever fragile thread was holding this moment together. Almost free, Michael murmured, though his words were barely sound at all. His fingers found the last embedded barb. It was buried deep, cruelly so, the metal biting against sensitive flesh. Tao's eyes flicked down as if he understood what Michael meant to do. The lion shifted, lowering his massive head until his muzzle nearly brushed the sand. It wasn't submission, but it wasn't aggression either. It was something between, a space where predator and man met without violence. Michael worked quickly, each tug sending blood down his own arm from the scrape he'd already taken. His mind flickered with memory. Detroit streets, fists and broken glass, the sound of orders shouted in desert wind during his army years. He'd survived those because he had learned to read intention in eyes, the moment when someone was going to strike, the instant when they wouldn't. Tao's gaze, for all its fire, did not carry the promise of an attack. It carried something else, patience or perhaps recognition. Then, with one last twist, the barb came free. The lion flinched but did not strike. Instead, Tao drew his paw back, flexing it gingerly, blood dripping into the sand. For a heartbeat, he stood perfectly still, his eyes never leaving Michael's face. Then came the sound no one expected, a soft chuff, a breathy huff used between lines as a sign of reassurance. It was almost gentle. The rifles lowered an inch, the tension shifting but not breaking. Michael backed away slowly, leaving the cutters on the ground. His knees were weak, his body trembling, but he forced his movements to remain steady. Tao stepped back too, limping slightly but carrying himself with unbroken dignity. With measured strides, he turned toward the grassland, each step deliberate, his tail swishing once before the tall blades swallowed him whole. For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of insects and the uneven beat of human hearts trying to steady themselves. The sanctuary erupted then, shouts, questions, fury, and relief all colliding in the hot air. Tom's face was crimson with anger, Lisa was pale with fear, and Sarah never stopped clicking her camera. Michael heard them but didn't answer. His eyes remained on the place where Tao had disappeared. The others saw danger narrowly averted. He had felt something else, something he couldn't yet name but knew was real. A lion had chosen restraint when violence was possible. A line had been crossed, not in blood, but in recognition. And that, he knew, was only the beginning of what this story would demand. The hours that followed unfolded in a blur of adrenaline and consequence. Michael's arm was wrapped hastily in gauze, his skin stinging with every movement, while the sanctuary staff scrambled to track Tao's movements across the reserve. Officially, it was treated as an emergency. An injured apex predator could spiral fast without intervention, but behind every professional order lingered the unspoken truth. What they had just witnessed didn't fit inside the tidy box of protocol. Tom stormed around the compound, his voice sharp with fury, while Sarah quietly slipped away to review her photographs. And Lisa, though outwardly calm, kept stealing glances at Michael as though searching for words she couldn't quite form. When the tranquilizer finally took hold and Tao was brought to the veterinary enclosure for treatment, Michael wasn't allowed near. He stood outside the clinic, watching through a narrow window as Lisa and her team worked around the sedated lion. They moved with quiet efficiency, cutting away dried blood, flushing the wound, pulling the last remnants of wire from the torn pad. Even under sedation, Tao's chest rose and fell with a heavy, powerful rhythm that filled the small space with awe. Every so often, one of the younger staff members looked nervously toward the glass, as though expecting him to burst through and finish what he had started earlier. None of them said it aloud, but the question hung thick in the air. Why had Tao spared him? Later, in Tom's office, the answer everyone wanted became the accusation Michael had expected. "You should be fired," Tom said flatly, his voice clipped with restrained anger. 7 years of service doesn't erase what you risked today. That lion could have torn your head off. Michael sat in silence, his bandaged arm resting on his lap. He didn't argue. He couldn't explain it in words that would satisfy rules and regulations. I know the protocols, he finally said, meeting Tom's gaze. But 5 minutes would have been too long. His words carried no triumph. Only the weight of a choice he couldn't undo. That evening, Sarah appeared with her camera slung across her shoulder, a quiet intensity radiating from her as she opened her laptop. "You need to see this," she said simply. On the screen, frame by frame, the truth came alive. The moment of eye contact, the man brushing Michael's shoulder, the stillness when violence could have erupted. In one photo, their faces were inches apart, both expressions strangely alike. Wary, tired, but undeniably aware. Tom leaned forward, his skepticism faltering as he whispered, "This doesn't look like a predator tolerating a man. This looks like something else." Sarah only nodded. "The world will want to see this," she said softly. "And they'll argue about it. But they'll see it." As night fell, Michael found himself back outside the clinic, drawn there by something he couldn't quite admit. Through the glass, Tao lay on padded flooring, his paw bandaged, his body immense even in stillness. Lisa adjusted the 4-line, checked vitals, then stepped outside to find Michael waiting. "He's stable," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "But I'll tell you this. I've treated lions for 15 years. By every measure I know, he should have attacked you. Yet he didn't." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "And when he lifted his head earlier, sedated as he was, do you know where he looked first?" Michael didn't answer. He already knew. "Straight at you," Lisa said, as if he recognized you. Inside, the lion stirred. Even with the glass between them, Michael felt the weight of Tao's gaze lock onto him. It wasn't casual, and it wasn't fleeting. The lion held it, unblinking, as if pinning Michael to the spot. Sarah, who had followed him quietly, lifted her camera again and captured the impossible. For a long moment, none of them spoke. Only when Tao's head lowered again, heavy with medication, did Lisa whisper the thought that unsettled them all. "Recognition isn't supposed to be possible." Michael's throat tightened, the silence around him carrying the quiet truth he hadn't dared to say aloud. Something extraordinary had begun, and it was far from over. By morning, the story had spread far beyond the sanctuary's fences. Sarah's photographs, though not yet published, had already circulated quietly among staff and visiting researchers. Whispers turned into debates in the dining hall, in offices, even at the edge of the enclosures where rangers usually spoke only of weather and routine patrols. The question hovered everywhere. Had a lion truly shown restraint, even recognition, toward a man kneeling at his feet? Tom tried to clamp down, issuing stern warnings about leaks and gossip. But he knew as well as anyone that what had happened could not be contained. Inside the clinic, Tao was stirring more fully as the sedation wore off. His chest rose in steady rhythm, his bandaged paw flexing against the padded flooring. When Michael appeared at the observation window, the reaction was immediate. The lion lifted his head, eyes sharpening with surprising clarity, and fixed on him once again. There was no mistaking it now. Lisa, who had been charting his vitals, froze mid-sentence, her pen hovering uselessly in the air. "He sees you," she whispered, almost in disbelief. Sarah raised her camera slowly, capturing the unmistakable intensity of the gaze. This wasn't random movement, nor the fog of sedation. It was deliberate. The board members who had arrived overnight watched from the control room, faces pressed to glass, struggling to reconcile what they saw with everything they believed about predator behavior. Tao rose shakily to his feet, every muscle taut with both power and discomfort. Then, in a movement that sent a wave of astonishment through the room, he lowered himself to the ground, arranging his body in the same posture Michael had taken the day before, kneeling, eyes level, paw extended. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. One of the board members muttered, "It looks like mimicry." Lisa, normally a bastion of scientific caution, only shook her head slowly. "It looks like recognition." Michael's chest tightened. Against every instinct, he knelt too, mirroring the lion once more, this time with glass between them. Tao's amber eyes locked on his, unwavering. For a long moment, silence wrapped the room, broken only by the rhythmic click of Sarah's camera. Then Tao exhaled that soft chuffing sound again, the low vocalization of reassurance that lions usually share within their own pride. Lisa's hand flew to her mouth. Tom's voice cracked over the radio to the tranquilizer team standing by. Hold your positions. Nobody moves. Time stretched thin in that small space. Michael spoke, his words barely audible. Thank you for trusting me. I'm glad you're healing. The lion's ears twitched, as though catching the cadence, if not the meaning. He stayed where he was, steady, unthreatening, as if answering in silence. When Michael finally stood, bound by the promise he had made not to push further, Tao rose with him. And then came the gesture that unsettled every witness in the room. Tao placed his uninjured paw against the glass, pressing with deliberate force. His eyes still locked on Michael's. Reflexively, Michael lifted his hand, meeting the massive paw through the transparent barrier. Sarah's shutter snapped furiously, but no one else moved. It was as if they were intruding on something not meant for human interference. The spell broke only when Tao withdrew, circling once before lying down again, his injured legs stretched in front of him. Michael turned, trembling but steady in voice. This isn't an accident. He knows. Tom wanted to dismiss it, to anchor the moment in reason, but the words caught in his throat. Dr. Wright, the visiting researcher, finally said what others were too afraid to. If this is what it looks like, it's a breakthrough. By nightfall, the preserve was no longer a quiet refuge. News outlets had begun calling. Donations poured in from people who had seen Sarah's preview shots online. And in the clinic, under dimmed lights and the watchful eyes of scientists and skeptics alike, a lion slept with the calm dignity of a king who had chosen not to kill, but to wait. Michael knew that tomorrow would bring decisions, debates, and risks far greater than the barbed wire fence. For tonight, though, he held on to the image of that paw pressed against the glass, a gesture that had shifted the balance between fear and understanding, and hinted at a bond the world was not ready to believe. Dawn broke cool and pale over the Kalahari, the kind of morning that carried both promise and unease. The reintroduction team moved with careful precision, setting protocols into place, tranquilizer rifles positioned, cameras rolling. Tao had healed well, his bandaged paw now strong enough to carry him with the effortless grace of a king restored. The plan was simple: return him to his territory and watch from a distance. But as the transport cage opened and Tao stepped out into the light, it became clear nothing about this moment would be simple. The gates of the facility had closed on Jerry, but Niadi never moved far from the perimeter. Through the long hours of surgery, as the medical team fought to clean away the infection and repair the damage to her leg, the great lion sat in the dust beyond the fence. He neither hunted nor rested properly, his amber eyes fixed on the compound. Rangers watched from the towers, some unnerved, others awed, as day gave way to night, and still he waited. It was a vigil that no one could explain and no one could ignore. Inside, Jerry clung to life. The infection had spread farther than first feared, requiring hours of painstaking work. Dr. Jessica and her team cut away necrotic tissue, flushed the wound, and stitched muscle with hands that never stopped moving. When at last she was wheeled into recovery, her survival was no longer a miracle in the making, but a fragile possibility. She had a chance, just enough of one dot when she stirred for the first time. Lifting her head weakly against the bandages, Niadi seemed to know. From outside the barrier, he rose, pressed against the fence, and gave a low chuffing sound. It was answered faintly from within. The staff who witnessed it fell silent, struck by the clear recognition between them. Whatever separated human and animal understanding, in that moment felt impossibly small. Days turned into weeks. Jerry regained her strength, slow at first, then faster, each step steadier under the watchful eyes of her caregivers. Through it all, Niadi remained close, accepting food and water provided at the perimeter but never straying far. His vigil became part of the daily rhythm of the facility, a reminder that the bond between the lions was not something that could be severed by walls or fear. The debate about what to do grew louder. Protocol dictated a clean separation, releases staged at different times. But Daniel, who had stood at Jerry's side in the clearing, argued that nothing about this case was normal. Niadi had sought help, had trusted humans with his mate, and had stood guard outside the gates for weeks. To break that bond now, he believed, would undo everything they had risked to preserve. Against precedent, the director agreed. A coordinated release would be attempted at dawn. 2 weeks later, The transports rolled out into the savannah. The air was cool, the sky painted with soft light, and a small team of rangers, Daniel among them, followed in silence. The vehicles halted at a clearing within Niati's territory. First, Jerry's compartment opened. She stepped out unsteadily, her gait uneven but strong enough to carry her forward. She paused, scenting the air, her ears pricking at the sounds of home. Moments later, the second door opened. Niati emerged with a steady stride, mane catching the morning light. He went directly to her, nuzzling her cheek, his body pressed close against hers. The humans who watched did not speak, afraid that even words might disturb the power of the scene.